Hello, good day to all. This is Miss A. Krishna Sundar, Assistant Professor, Department of English from KAHM Unity Women's College, Manjeri. Today, I will be dealing with the very first chapter from the textbook Spectrum, prescribed for BA BSc 4th semester General English students by Calicut University. So here comes the title of the chapter, Divided Times, How Literature Teaches Us to Understand the Other. Before we step into the chapter, let's have a brief look at the biography of the writer. The writer here is Amanda Mihalopoulos, and Mihalopoulos was born in Athens in Greece in the year 1966. She graduated in French literature and has pursued her studies from various European universities. She won the Ravematha Award for her story Life is Colorful Outside. She has also worked as a columnist for many Greek newspapers. She has written a number of books, including short stories and novels, and her famous novels include As Often You Can Bear It in the year 1998, Why I Killed My Best Friend in the year 2003, How to Hide in 2010, and God's Wife, published in the year 2014. Her books have been translated into various languages too. This chapter is an extraction from her opening speech of Second International Literature Festival of Odessa, and it was translated by Karen Emmerich. Before moving on to the chapter, I would like to communicate with you about one particular point regarding this chapter. This chapter is in fact a translated work. Mihalopoulos actually delivered her speech in her mother tongue and it was translated into English. It is always believed that a translated work cannot encompass the complete essence of its original work. In other words, reading a translated work is just like kissing your beloved through a veil, which means much of its essence would be lost in the process of translation. So here we are going to deal with such a translation piece of work. So I would be sharing my basic understanding regarding this chapter. So what is this chapter about? This is the very first chapter of the textbook, and being the very first chapter, this piece of writing actually sets the tone of the entire book. This chapter will definitely help us to understand the importance of literature. This will also enable us to understand the need to study literature. Unlike any other academic or scientific disciplines, literature is considered as a reflection of real life. Literature becomes a reflection of life because literature deals with human emotions, human conditions, and human relationships. Moreover, literature helps us to see things from a different perception. Literature helps us to analyze and problematize situations from a different pedestal or from a different platform. Literature enables us to elevate the ethics and values in our life. This chapter is a rereading of European classics, and through the rereading of these classics, Mihalopoulos tries to drive home the fact that literature can influence people and literature can definitely change the attitude of the people. Literature also helps us to cultivate humanitarian values and to inspire and kindle imagination. Mihalopoulos begins her speech by discussing 4 different writers from 4 different countries who have narrated 4 different stories. The first one is a Greek writer, the second one is an English writer, the third one is a German, and the fourth one is a writer from Spain. Though all the four writers come from different countries and they narrate different stories, they have one single common theme, and that is the plot or the theme which reflects human conditions or human relationships. So all the four stories are about human conditions and human emotions. The first one, the Greek writer narrates the story of a man tossed in the sea after a war and is returning home. The English writer tells the story of a prince who cannot make decisions and cannot decide for himself. The German writer deals with the story of a farmer who thinks he is a knight and goes for adventures. The writer from Spain talks about a man who falls in love with another man's wife and dies at the end. Here we have got four different authors with four different storylines. But all the storylines come back and focus at one single point, that is human condition. If we are to take a closer look at these four storylines, we realize that these are the stories which are very familiar to us. Or in other words, these are popular stories which are still revolving around the globe. The Greek writer is actually Homer, and his work is Odyssey. I'm sure that you might have heard about the names like Iliad and Odyssey, which are considered as the two great epics in the history of Greek literature. Just like Ramayana and Mahabharata in Indian literature, these two, Iliad and Odyssey, are considered as the two great epics in Greek literature. Homer's Odyssey is one such classic, and it deals with the protagonist whose name is Odysseus. The second story, which the English writer has written, is about a prince, and this is actually the play titled as Hamlet, written by the universal dramatist William Shakespeare. Hamlet is considered to be one of the most celebrated plays by Shakespeare, and this is regarded as one of the longest plays written by Shakespeare. The third one, the story written by a German, is actually the story of Don Quixote, which was written by Cervantes, the German writer. Don Quixote is considered as a masterpiece in the history of literature. The fourth one, written by the writer Goethe, is with the title The Sorrows of Young Werther. This is again considered as a classical work. If we look at all these four stories, we realize that all these are classics which are very popular. Homer's Odyssey, Shakespeare's Hamlet, Cervantes' Don Quixote, and Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. To analyze the heroes of these stories, we understand that the first one has the hero Odysseus. The second one includes the hero whose name is Hamlet. The third one is Don Quixote, and the fourth one is Werther. We understand that these four are the great classics in the history of English literature. A classic is a work or a piece of literature which has actually stood the test of time. They might have passed through different ages, different generations, and different time spans, and are still not forgotten by the people. They still revolve around the people across the globe. If we look at all the four major characters here, they have always been popular heroes in history. We often talk about them, we learn about them, we admire them, and we adore them. So, in short, They are the celebrated heroes or the glorified heroes that we talk about in our everyday life. But to look at it from a different angle means to consider them as anti-heroes. In other words, if you look at these characters from a different perspective, you can see that they are not always the same celebrated or glorified heroes. In most cases, they were marginalized anti-heroes. Why have they become marginalized anti-heroes? Let us see how. What happens to Odysseus? Now, Odysseus is actually the king of Ithaca. He entrusts the duty of ruling Ithaca to his son Telemachus, and he joins the Trojan War. He disappears from Ithaca for a long period, and once the war is over, Odysseus decides to return. On his way back home, he suffers from a shipwreck and he comes to the shore where he is identified by the princess of the shore whose name is Nausicaa. When you look at Odysseus from the eyes of Nausicaa, she finds him as a person without proper clothes, without proper food, and without proper shelter. So, in the eyes of Nausicaa, Odysseus is just a refugee without anything. Moreover, in the eyes of the people in Ithaca, Odysseus had always been an irresponsible ruler. But Odysseus is still a celebrated hero in literature. But at the time when he really survived, he was not a celebrated hero in the society in which he lived. Now, to look at the next character, Hamlet. Hamlet is a prince of Denmark. His father is killed by his uncle named Claudius, and unfortunately, his mother gets married to his uncle Claudius immediately after his father's death without knowing that Claudius is a murderer. Hamlet now decides to avenge his father's death. He decides to kill his uncle Claudius, and he tries in a number of occasions, but he fails. He fails desperately and he fails terribly. He actually is seen as an indecisive, incapable prince by the people of Denmark. He is seen as a prince who is vacillating, flexible in his views, and a prince who procrastinates things. So Hamlet is a hero in literature, but in real life, Hamlet was not a glorified hero. He was considered as a vacillating and procrastinating prince. Coming to Don Quixote, Don Quixote was an ordinary farmer who believed himself to be a knight. He used to gallop on horseback and he continued with his adventurous stories. Don Quixote, with his adventures, becomes a celebrated hero in literature, but at the time when Don Quixote really lived, he was considered as a madman in the eyes of the society. Similarly, Werther, who is completely in love with a lady whose name is Charlotte, is seen as a crazy man. Werther is mad in love and he finally dies at the end of the story with an unrequited love story. So Werther, though a celebrated hero, is seen as a crazy man by the society. Now, if we look at all the four characters like Odysseus, Hamlet, Don Quixote, and Werther, all the four are celebrated heroic characters in literature. But in fact, if you look at them from a different perception, we realize that they were just marginalized people or they were just remaining as others. Who are the others in a society is the next question. Any minority different from the mainstream society is another. Transgenders belong to this category. Homosexuals belong to this category. migrants, refugees, all these people come under this category. The reason is that these particular groups are actually isolated and discriminated in a society just because their inclinations are different, just because their ideologies are different, just because they are not familiar with the routines and norms of the society, they are completely alienated and neglected in a society. So, being different is being isolated from the society. But Mihalapalo tells us that this difference can be seen as a sign of courage if you look at it from literature perspective. People who are different should be understood and should be respected through the perception of literature. Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, says tragedy is the imitation of an action. The imitation of an action is definitely human action, which is again a human condition. Literature encompasses all these emotions like guilt, love, jealousy, despair, anxiety, fear, and many more. And Mihalapalo says that if you start looking at people from literature perceptions, the difference that they own will not be treated as a malfunction, but instead it will be considered as a sign of courage, and it will be considered as a sign of difference which has to be respected. So, the other is always feared and distanced by the society, and this has to change, and this can change only through literature. Literature gives you a new facet to include them or to incorporate them into the normal social structure. These people are continuously excluded from the normal structure of the society. In the present scenario, we find a number of news, discussions, documentaries, etc. based on refugees and many other minorities. This happens because people are scared of them and they believe that these people come to tyrannize the normal people in the society. Now, this attitude has to change, and Mihalapalo says that this attitude can be changed only if you start looking at them from a different platform, from a different pedestal, and try understanding their difference. And this difference has to be treated with respect, and with this respect, we can incorporate them into the normal structure, the mainstream structure of a society. Mihalapalo also adds that even if education collapses, literature can stand as a substitute or as another platform for education because literature has got the capacity to transform our fears into humanity. Literature, as a discipline which deals with human conditions, can really help you to elevate the values and ethics in your life. So, literature can transform anything. Literature can change people. Literature can change the attitudes and mindsets of the people. So, things which are seen with a difference should be analyzed in a varied way when you look at it through the lens of literature. So, this is the crux of the entire piece, and thank you very much for your patient listening. If you have any doubts, clarifications, suggestions, or inputs, it would be greatly appreciated if you can connect with me. Please do not hesitate to contact me in my email ID. Thank you. Thank you once again for your patient listening. Have a good day.